Hi everyone, we are back for another 2 chapters of the BFG. I'm reading inside today, so hopefully there will be much less interruptions and distractions. The home audience has agreed to be calm and listen. Here they are.
Hi.
Sitting calmly,
Hi.
ready to listen to the next 2 chapters before the weekend. Okay, then we'll continue it next week as well. It's fun reading a whole chapter book together. Okay, so we left off. Sophie and the BFG were still having a conversation about how things work and what the BFG does. And Sophie learned that the BFG collects dreams and then gives children good dreams. So it really does seem like the BFG is a great person or giant and friendly, but all the other giants are not, and they eat people. And so now he's keeping Sophie inside his home so that she doesn't get eaten by the other giants, but he also won't let her go home because he doesn't want her to tell all the people where she lives about the giants. And when we left off, he was hungry. So the next chapter is called Snozcumbers. But if you don't eat people like all the others, Sophie said, then what do you live on? That is a squelching, tricky problem around here, the BFG answered. In this slosh-flunking giant country, happy eats like pineapples and pigwinkles is simply not growing. Nothing is growing except for one extremely icky-poo vegetable. It is called the snozcumber. The snozcumber, cried Sophie. There's no such thing. The BFG looked at Sophie and smiled, showing about 20 of his square teeth. Yesterday, he said, we was not believing in giants, was we? Today we is not believing in snozcumbers. Just because we happen to not have actually seen something with our own 2 little winkles, we think it is not existing. What about, for instance, the great squizzly Scotch hopper? I beg your pardon, Sophie said. And the humplecrimp. What's that? Sophie said. And the rap rascal. The what? Sophie said. And the crumpscottle. Are they animals? Sophie asked. They is common animals, said the BFG contemptuously. I is not a very know-it-all giant myself, but it seems to me that you is an absolutely know-nothing human being. Your brain is full of rotten wool. You mean cotton wool, Sophie said. What I mean and what I say is 2 different things, the BFG announced rather grandly. I will now show you a snozcumber. The BFG flung open a massive cupboard and took out the weirdest-looking thing Sophie had ever seen. It was about half as long, again, as an ordinary man, but much thicker. It was as thick around its girth as a perambulator. It was black with white stripes along its length, and it was covered all over with coarse knobbles. Here's the giant snozcumber. That sort of looks like a weird cucumber, but not quite.
It looks disgusting. I wonder if
Here is the repulsant snozcumber, cried the BFG, waving it about. I squoggle it, I mispise it, I desponge it. But because I is refusing to gobble up human beings like the other giants, I must spend my life guzzling up icky-poo snozcumbers instead. If I don't, I will be nothing but skin and groans. You mean skin and bones, Sophie said. I know it is bones, the BFG said, but please understand that I cannot be helping it if I sometimes is saying things a little squiggly. I is trying my very best all the time. The big friendly giant looked suddenly so forlorn that Sophie got quite upset. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to be rude. There never was any schools to teach me talking in giant country, the BFG said sadly. But couldn't your mother have taught you? Sophie asked. My mother, cried the BFG. Giants don't have mothers. Surely you is knowing that. I did not know that, Sophie said. Who ever heard of a woman giant? Shouted the BFG, waving the snozcumber around his head like a lasso. There never was a woman giant, and there never will be one. Giants is always men. Sophie felt herself getting a little muddled. In that case, she said, how were you born? Giants isn't born, the BFG answered. Giants appears, and that's all there is to it. They simply appears, the same way as the sun and the stars. And when did you appear? Sophie asked. Now how on earth could I be knowing a thing like that, said the BFG. It was so long ago I couldn't count. You mean you don't even know how old you are? No giant is knowing that, the BFG said. All I is knowing about myself is that I is very old, very, very old and crumply, perhaps as old as this earth. What happens when a giant dies? Sophie asked. Giants is never dying, the BFG answered. Sometimes and quite suddenly a giant is disappearing and nobody is ever knowing where he goes to, but mostly us giants is simply going on and on like whiffsy time twiddlers. The BFG was still holding the awesome snozcumber in his right hand, and now he put one end into his mouth and bit off a huge chunk of it. He started crunching it up, and the noise he made was like the crunching of lumps of ice. "It's filthing," he spluttered, speaking with his mouth full and spraying large pieces of snozcumber like bullets in Sophie's direction. Sophie hopped around on the tabletop, ducking out of the way. "It's disgusterous," the BFG gurgled. "It's sickable, it's rotsome, it's maggot-wise. Try it yourself, this foulsome snozcumber." "No, thank you," Sophie said, backing away. "It's all you're going to be guzzling around here from now on, so you might as well get used to it," said the BFG. "Go on, you snipsy little winkle, have a go." Sophie took a small nibble. "Ugh," she sputtered. "Oh no, oh gosh, oh help." She spat it out quickly. "It tastes of frog skins," she gasped, "and rotten fish." "Worse than that," cried the BFG, roaring with laughter. "To me it is tasting of clock coaches and slime wanglers." And here's a picture of him eating the snozcumber and spitting pieces out. And on the next page, there's a picture of them talking again. "Do we really have to eat it?" Sophie said. "You do, unless you is wanting to become so thin you will be disappearing into thick ear." "Into thin air," Sophie said. "A thick ear is something quite different." Once again, that sad, winsome look came into the BFG's eyes. "Words," he said, "is oh such a twitch-tinkling problem to me all my life. So you must simply try to be patient and stop squibbling. As I am telling you before, I know exactly what words I am wanting to say, but somehow or another, they is always getting squiff-squiddled around." "That happens to everyone," Sophie said. "Not like it happens to me," the BFG said. "I is speaking the most terrible Wiglish." "I think you speak beautifully," Sophie said. "You do?" cried the BFG, suddenly brightening. "You really do?" "Simply beautifully," Sophie repeated. "Well, that is the nicest present anybody is ever giving me in my whole life," cried the BFG. "Are you sure you're not twiddling my leg?" "Of course not," Sophie said. "I just love the way you talk." "How wondercrump," cried the BFG, still beaming. "How whoopsie splunkers. How absolutely squiffling. I is all of a stutter." "Listen," Sophie said, "we don't have to eat snozcumbers. In the fields around our village, there are all sorts of lovely vegetables, like cauliflowers and carrots. Why don't you go get some of those the next time you go visiting?" The BFG raised his great head proudly in the air. "I is a very honorable giant," he said. "I would rather be chewing up rotsome snozcumbers than snitching things from other people." "You stole me," Sophie said. "I did not steal you very much," said the BFG, smiling gently. "After all, you is only a tiny little girl." And that's the end of that chapter. And we'll read one more, but what do you guys think about the way he talks? It's funny, right? Lots of made-up words in this story. Home audience comment.
I think Sophie's gonna turn into a giant.
You do? Sawyer thinks Sophie might turn into a giant. We'll see. We're going to make some predictions today.
Then the person who works there to pretend that she's the mom runs into the giant world, and then she recognizes Sophie, and then she eats in, and they become friends.
Oh, all right. Perhaps. The blood bottler. That doesn't sound good. Suddenly, a tremendous thumping noise came from outside the cave entrance, and a voice like thunder shouted, "Runt, is you there, Runt? I is hearing you jabbling. Who is you jabbling to, Runt?" "Look out," cried the BFG, "it's the blood bottler." But before he had finished speaking, the stone was rolled aside, and a 50-foot giant, more than twice as tall and as wide as the BFG, came striding into the cave. He was naked except for a dirty little piece of cloth around his bottom. Sophie was on the tabletop. The enormous, partly eaten snozcumber was lying near her. She ducked behind it. The creature came clumping into the cave and stood towering over the BFG. "Who was you jabbling to in here just now?" he boomed. "I is jabbling to myself," the BFG answered. "Pilful fizz," shouted the blood bottler. "Bug swallop," he boomed. "You is talking to a human being, that's what I is thinking." "No, no," cried the BFG. "Yus, yus," boomed the blood bottler. "I is guessing you has snitched away a human being and brought it back to your bunghole as a pet. So now I is winkling it out and guzzling it as extra snacks before my supper." And here's a picture of the even more giant, the blood bottler. Look how much bigger he is than the BFG.
Why?
He's an even bigger giant.
Why is he?
Maybe because he eats people. The poor BFG was very nervous. There is no one in here, he stammered. Why don't you leave me alone? The blood bottler pointed a finger as large as a tree trunk at the BFG. Runty little scum-screwer, he shouted. Piffling little swish-figgler, squimpy little bottlewort, prunty little pog-swiller. I is now going to search the primroses. He grabbed the BFG by the arm. And you is going to help me do it. Us together is going to winkle out this tasteful little human being, he shouted. The BFG had intended to whisk Sophie off the table as soon as he got the chance and hide her behind his back, but now there was no hope of doing this. Sophie peered around the chewed-off end of the enormous snozcumber, watching the two giants as they moved away down the cave. The blood bottler was a gruesome sight. His skin was reddish pink. There was black hair sprouting on his chest and arms and on his stomach. The hair on his head was long and dark and tangled. His foul face was round and squashy looking. The eyes were tiny black holes. The nose was small, but the mouth was huge. It spread right across the face, almost ear to ear, and it had lips that were like two gigantic purple frankfurters lying one on top of the other. Craggy yellow teeth stuck out between the two purple frankfurter lips, and rivers of spit ran down over the chin. It was not in the least difficult to believe that this ghastly brute ate men, women, and children every night. The blood bottler, still holding the BFG by the arm, was examining the rows and rows of bottles. You and your pibbling bottles, he shouted. What is you putting in them? Nothing that would interest you, the BFG answered. You is only interested in guzzling human beings. And you is dotty as a dog swaggler, cried the blood bottler. These words are hard to say. Soon the blood bottler would be coming back, Sophie told herself, and he was bound to search the tabletop. But she couldn't possibly jump off the table. It was 12 feet high. She'd break a leg. The snozcumber, although it was thick as a perambulator, was not going to hide. Please stop doing that. Was not going to hide her if the blood bottler picked it up. She examined the chewed-off end. It had large seeds in the middle, each one as big as a melon. They were embedded in soft, slimy stuff. Taking care to stay out of sight, Sophie reached forward and scooped away half a dozen of these seeds. This left a hole in the middle of the snozcumber large enough for her to crouch in so long as she rolled herself up into a ball. She crawled into it. It was wet and slimy. But what did that matter if she was going to save her from being eaten? The blood bottler and the BFG were coming back towards the table now. The BFG was nearly fainting with fear. Any moment, he was telling himself Sophie would be discovered and eaten. Suddenly, the blood bottler grabbed the half-eaten snozcumber. The BFG stared at the bare table. Sophie, where is she? He thought desperately. She cannot be possibly jumpelling off that high table, so where is she hiding, Sophie? So this is the filthing rotsome glubbage you was eating, boomed the blood bottler, holding up the partly eaten snozcumber. You must be cockles to be guzzling such rub squash. For a moment, the blood bottler seemed to have forgotten about his search for Sophie. The BFG decided to lead him further off the track. That is the scrum-diddly-umptious snozcumber, he said. I is guzzling it gleefully every night and day. Is you never trying a snozcumber, blood bottler? Human beans is juicier, the blood bottler said. You is talking rummy rot, the BFG said, growing braver by the second. He was thinking that if only he could get the blood bottler to take one bite of the repulsive vegetable, the sheer foulness of its flavor would send him bellowing out of the cave. But remember who's in there. I is happy to let you sample it, the BFG went on. But please, when you see how truly glumptious it is, do not be guzzling the whole thing. Leave me a little snitchet for my supper. The blood bottler stared suspiciously with small piggy eyes at the snozcumber. Sophie, crouching inside the chewed-off end, began to tremble all over. You is not switch-fiddling me, is you? Said the blood bottler. Never, cried the BFG passionately. Take a bite, and I am positive you will be shouting out, how scrum-diddly-umptious this wonder serving is. The BFG could see the greedy blood bottler's mouth beginning to water more than ever at the prospect of extra food. Vegetables are very good for you, he went on. It is not healthsome always to be eating meaty things. Just this once, for the blood bottler said, I is going to taste these rotsome eats of yours, but I is warning you that if it is filthsome, I is smashing it over your sludgy little head. He picked up the snozcumber. He began raising it on its long journey to his mouth, some 50 feet up into the air. Sophie wanted to scream, don't! But that would have been an even more certain death. Crouching among the slimy seeds, she felt herself being lifted up and up and up. Suddenly, there was a crunch as the blood bottler bit a huge hunk off the end. Sophie saw his yellow teeth clamping together a few inches from her head. Then there was utter darkness. She was in his mouth. She caught a whiff of his evil-smelling breath. It stank of bad meat. She waited for the teeth to go crunch one more. She prayed that she would be killed quickly. Ouch! Roared the blood bottler. Squelch each! And then he spat. All of the great lumps of snozcumber that were in his mouth, as well as Sophie herself, went shooting out across the cave. If Sophie had struck the stony wall of the cave, she would most certainly have been in trouble. Instead, she hit the soft folds of the BFG's black cloak hanging against the wall. She dropped to the ground, half stunned. She crawled under the hem of the cloak, and there she crouched. "You little swine bugler," roared the blood bottler. "You little pig swiller." He rushed at the BFG and smashed what was left of the snozcumber over his head. Fragments of the filthy vegetable slashed all over the cave. "You is not loving it?" the BFG asked innocently, rubbing his head. "Loving it," yelled the blood bottler. "That is the most disgustorous taste that is ever touching my teeth." And here's a picture of him spitting it out. Lucky for Sophie.
I want to see. Where's Sophie?
She's not in. Oh, there she is. She's flying through the air. See her really tiny there, flying.
Yeah, I see her. I want to see. That's her?
You must be buggles to be swallowing
That's her?
sludge like that. Every night you could be galloping off happy as a hamburger and gobbling juicy human beans. Eating human beans is wrong and evil, the BFG said. "It is guzzly and glumptious," shouted the blood bottler, "and tonight I is galloping off to Chile to swabble a few human chili beans. Is you wishing to know why I is choosing Chile?" "I is not wishing to know anything," the BFG said, very dignified. "I is choosing Chile," the blood bottler said, "because I is fed up with the taste of Eskimos. It is important I has plenty of cold treats in this scuddling hot weather, and the next coldest thing to an Eskimo is a Chile bean. Human beans from Chile is very chilly." "Horrible," the BFG said. "You ought to be ashamed. Other giants is all saying they is wanting to gallop off to England tonight to guzzle school chittlers," the blood bottler said. "I is very fond indeed of English school chittlers. They has a nice inky booky flavor. Perhaps I will change my mind and go to England with them." "You is disgusting," the BFG said, "and you is an insult to the giant peoples," shouted the blood bottler. "You is not fit to be a giant. You is squinky little squiddler. You is a pibbling little pitsqueak. You is a cream puff nut." With that, the horrible blood-bottling giant strode out of the cave. The BFG ran to the cave entrance and quickly rolled the stone back into place. "Sophie," he whispered. "Sophie, where is you, Sophie?" Sophie emerged from under the hem of the black cloak. "I'm here," she said. The BFG picked her up and held her tenderly in the palm of his hand. "Oh, I is so happy to be finding you all in one lump," he said. "I was in his mouth," Sophie said. "You was what?" cried the BFG. Sophie told him what had happened, and there I was, telling him to eat the filthsome snozcumber, and you was all the time inside of it, the BFG cried. "Not so much fun," said Sophie. "Just look at you, you poor little chidler," cried the BFG. "You is all covered in snozcumber and giant spit." He set about cleaning her up as best as he could. "I is hating those other giants more than ever now," he said. "You know what I would like?" "What?" Sophie said. "I should like to find a way of disappearing them, every single one." "I'd be glad to help you," Sophie said. "Let me see if I can't think up a way of doing it." And here's a picture of the BFG cleaning off Sophie.
I think the start of the next chapter is going to be on the next page.
Yep, that's the end of this chapter. So hopefully Sophie and the BFG will come up with a plan over the weekend and today. Think about what you predict might happen next.